It is virtually impossible to pinpoint the moment Michael Bennett first had the idea of doing the show that became a chorus line. But as early as 1972, Bennett was telling close associates of his intent to use the unhappiness of dancers as his basis for the show. Bob Avian was Michael Bennett's right-hand man and longtime collaborator.
He told me he had an idea about dance. All the time when he was doing shows, Michael kept on saying,
"I'd love to do a show just with dances, about dancers, and make that an evening."
I remember him talking about it, especially after Company. He wanted to do a show with a lot of dancing in it. He had this idea of creating a dance/theater piece with music. It would begin in a rehearsal room with one dancer at the bar, then another one would join, and it would show the privacy of the dance and the feeling between dancers.
Bennett knew from the start that he wished to pay tribute to the very unique species of performer, and in doing so, pay tribute to his roots, to himself.
Michael was trying to recreate the period of time in his life when he was happiest, and that was when he was a chorus boy. He was longing for the innocence, the pure expression of just going in there and working, backing up the star, dishing with the guys, having flirtations, standing in the back going, "God, I am better than that director." It was a time of innocence for him.
One of the most catastrophic musicals ever to get to Broadway was called Rachel Lily Rosenblum. And that show provided the motivation for one of the most triumphant shows in Broadway history. Tony Stevens, who was the choreographer of Rachel, and Michon Peacock were so strongly affected by the personal affront of that debacle that they were unable to shake it off and go into the next chorus line job.
It was a horrible story. The two directors treated people terribly and were actually nasty, particularly to the dancers. Tony and I started hashing through what we could do about the conditions that the dancers had to deal with on a regular basis. Our goal was to create a company and come up with our own show in which the dancers did everything.
A chorus line might never have come into being if Peacock and Stevens hadn't turned to Bennett in the beginning of 1974.
When we didn't know how to take the first step, I called Michael. He said he had some kind of germ of an idea in his mind.
Peacock, Stevens, and Bennett all had a passionate desire to do something by, for, and about dancers.
The three of us drew up a list of people to invite. I asked Michael if Nicholas Dante could come. I knew Nicholas had never worked with Michael, but he was not only a dancer, but a writer, and I wanted him to be there as a writer to share his experience.
Michael specifically did not want just his dancers to attend because he didn't feel they would all open up to him.
At midnight on Saturday, January 18th, 1974, Bennett and 18 dancers, some of whom came directly from dancing in shows on Broadway, arrived at the Nicholas Exercise Center on East 23rd Street in Manhattan. One of those dancers was Wayne Cilento.
I was excited, but terrified. Tommy Walsh, Sammy Williams, and myself made a deal that we'd go if the other two did. If one didn't, the others wouldn't.
The entire group was a collection of friends, enemies, and strangers whose lives would be altered in the next 12 hours. Shortly after arriving at midnight, they all took a dance class, beginning by doing that which gave these people their identity. Many of those in attendance were relieved to dance first. After dancing, everyone sat down in a circle, and Bennett began.
We are here to explore where we have come from, where we have been, and where we are going. Talk about your childhood and family background, and what made you start dancing. What attracted you to a career in show business? Your life story.
Michael had made arrangements with Michon and Tony ahead of time to be able to tape the whole evening. Michael was always thinking.
Just like Paul in a chorus line, I kept asking myself all night long if I would be able to tell my story. I was really concerned about having to reveal it, but I didn't have a choice. Not even for my own good, but for the good of whatever was to come out of that evening. I had to.
What was so profound to me was that this group of people would sit down and collaborate in this way and give of their personal lives. Even people who didn't like each other were drawn together.
Because Michael was a working director-choreographer, it meant that all of a sudden you had a father figure in the room. It was meant to be equal, but with Michael there, it wasn't. A lot of these kids were Buddhist at the time and were into sharing their experience. They purged themselves, and Michael became their motivator, just like Zach in a chorus line.
So intense and important had this experience been for all those involved that it was immediately decided to do it again.
After the second session, Tony, Nick, and I met with Michael.
Michael told us there was no show there, maybe a book. No show there? Who's he kidding, no show? I'll write a show!
Although Bennett was unclear in the spring of 1974 about what his next move should be, Peacock, Stevens, and Dante had never wavered in their determination to see their goal fulfilled. The three formed their own company and were about to begin work on a piece entitled The Third Girl from the Left, on the Left in Green. It was to focus on a chorus line, particularly one girl's experience of being on the line.
I was writing vignettes, and Tony Stevens had begun to develop choreographic ideas.
It became very clear that one person was going to have to be at the helm of this, and that none of us wanted to be that person. Michael called us before we resolved anything.
Joe Papp wants me to do something at the Public Theater, and I think there is something in those tapes. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a book, a theater piece, a play, or a Broadway musical, but there's something in all this stuff we did. Why don't you sell me the tapes?
And so each person sold his or her story for $1 in the good faith that if something came out of this, they would share and be part of it.
Most people now know that the story Paul tells in a chorus line is mine. I was a drag queen until my late teens. Then I studied dance for about 4 or 5 years. I had always wanted to write. I wrote when I was very little and wanted to major in journalism. But I quit school in 1955 because people made such terrible fun of me. After we had several meetings of the newly formed theater group, I got a call from Michael.
I think there is a show in here, and I would like you to help me write it, if you're interested. If we can't pull it off, we'll get another writer until we get it right. Would you like to try?
Michael really didn't know whether or not I could write. And I realized years later that he wanted me because he wanted my story. He must have thought I wouldn't give him my story if there was no stake in it for me. I think Michael was that shrewd.
The tapes were then transcribed, and Bennett, Avian, and Dante began working with the stories.
Nicholas and I were working on the book, and in my head, I had most of the cast. I told Joe Papp at the Public Theater, I want to do this musical, and all you have to do is pay everybody $100 a week or something. I want to hire the cast first because I can only do this musical if I do it on the people.
A chorus line would be cast and put into rehearsal before it was even written.
In the case of a chorus line, you couldn't talk to writers about dramatizing a rehearsal scene or dramatizing what a dancer goes through, working very hard to look like every other dancer in the room. I had to dummy chunks of the show on people before the writers could write it.
By the time Marvin Hamlish was hired to compose the music, he had already won 4 Grammy Awards and made Hollywood history by winning 3 Academy Awards in the same broadcast. But he had never written the musical.
When Michael called me about a chorus line, he was already pretty well into the idea of the project.
Marvin was a dance arranger. He and I started out together, and we'd known each other since we were 20 or 21. He knew more about dancing than almost any other composer in the musical theater, so he was the ideal choice for this.
Unlike Hamlish, the man Bennett chose as lyricist was totally unknown to the public.
Michael called me. He had heard my work only once when I auditioned a score for him a year before.
The first time I saw the name Ed Kleben,
Michael was looking for someone to work with Marvin, and he thought of me. I'm a composer as well.
I'm offering you half of what you usually do. Would you be interested?
I'd never met Marvin.
Marvin's a lot more Jewish than you are, but I think it'll work out.
Michael brought us together. He was the rabbi, he made the marriage. We met on the west side at the home of my parents. Neutral ground.
He introduced us and left the room.
Ed was very concerned about me. I was very concerned about him.
And Marvin and I spent 6 weeks kicking each other in the stomach a lot, as you do in the beginning of a collaboration. But after about 6 weeks and about 3 really lousy numbers, all openings as I recall, we finally came up with a good number everybody seemed to like.
Now that Bennett had his team assembled, it was time to find the cast. It may come as a surprise that auditions were held at all. Bennett insisted, however, that everyone, whether they'd been present at the tape sessions or not, had to audition for the workshop.
It was funny to some people when they were given their own life transcribed to read as their audition.
Those of us who had been at the tape sessions were really pissed off that we had to audition at all.
When someone didn't get hired to play his or her own life story, it wasn't so much because they weren't good. It had more to do with Michael picking very specific individual types.
We went into rehearsal with no music and no lyrics and 3/4 of a script.
At this point, the show had no design. It was basically one monologue after another. Interesting, but not real theater.
The first workshop was all dancing. Michael got to know how all of us danced and how strong we were.
It wasn't improvising. It was sketching out. I staged an opening number without the music and without the lyric that's currently in the show.
Throughout the process, Hamlish and Kleben were in attendance, observing the choreographic patterns, interviewing dancers during breaks, and simply absorbing the atmosphere of the dancers' world.
We wrote the songs as we rehearsed and watched things.
During the first workshop, we spent weeks on the opening number. The first number Marvin and Ed worked on was for the opening. It was originally a big number called Resume, about all the shows all the dancers had all been in. We started staging it, but Ed Kleben felt we needed a traditional musical theater I Want song to establish up front what the characters wanted, like Wouldn't It Be Lovely from My Fair Lady. So that number eventually came to be about the need they had, as opposed to just exposition, as in the first workshop.
Near the very end of the first workshop, Bennett employed a startling method of obtaining a real reaction from the cast.
Michael told myself and the production stage manager,
I want to do this scene, but I don't want to spend weeks rehearsing it.
Michael was rehearsing one, tap dancing with the kids, and all of a sudden, he fell. Bang! The strong kids all came running to see what they could do. The more frightened ones pulled away, and the confused ones just sort of hung where they were. Some began crying hysterically. Michael maintained this for about 4 or 5 minutes while I pretended to call our doctor. All of a sudden, Michael looked up and said,
Does everybody remember exactly what they did?
Half of them were furious. He immediately staged the scene, and everybody knew exactly where they had gone and what they did and what their reaction was. Much of the dialogue in Paul's accident scene was later written, but their reaction was all real.
The first workshop was mostly about dancing. Usually in the process of creating a musical, the dancing is one of the last elements to be added to a show. A chorus line reversed all of that, which greatly confused the songwriters, and they struggled to find the rhythm of the show. The breakthrough came with the song At the Ballet, which is a dazzling combination of song, dialogue, and staging, and beautifully combines the stories of 3 of the female dancers.
When Marvin played the song for us, Michael cried. He said,
That's it. That's what I want the score to sound like.
Hamlish always said that that song was the heart of a chorus line.